The chain around my wife's car clinked in the sunlight like handcuffs, and in that moment, it felt like her freedom had been stolen. My chest tightened as I stood outside the hospital, helpless, staring at the cruel lock clamped on the only vehicle that could take her home. She had just given birth, still pale, still trembling from the fight her body had waged to bring our child into this world. But instead of celebrating our daughter's first breath, we were met with the sharp, venomous smile of Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of our HOA. "Rules are rules," she sneered, twisting the key in her hand as if it was her badge of honor. She had no idea whose car she'd just chained or whose patience she had just shattered. I remember how everything started that morning. My wife Emily had been lying in her hospital bed, exhausted but glowing in her fragile way, her hair damp with sweat and her eyes heavy but full of love. Our daughter Grace had been placed in her arms only hours earlier, a miracle we thought we'd never see after years of heartbreak, miscarriage after miscarriage. Emily had whispered, "Please just promise me when it's time we go home without any more stress. I want peace." I squeezed her hand and swore to her I would protect her peace with everything I had. I didn't know the storm waiting outside. When the nurse finally cleared her to leave, I walked out to pull the car around. That's when I saw it. The silver chain wound through the wheel, padlocked so tight it gleamed like mockery under the afternoon sun. For a second, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe hospital security had done it for some reason. But then I heard the click of heels, the cloying scent of Karen's perfume, and her shrill voice that could cut glass. "You can't park here. This isn't your space. This is for approved residents only," she spat, folding her arms across her chest like a soldier defending a battlefield that never belonged to her in the first place. "This is the hospital," I said, my voice cracking with disbelief. "My wife just gave birth. She's waiting inside. I need the car now." Karen tilted her head, feigning pity that never touched her eyes. "Well, maybe you should have thought of that before breaking HOA policy. Hospital or not, you're still under our jurisdiction. Pay the fine, then we'll see about unlocking it." For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. Rage surged through me, but beneath it was something worse, fear. Emily had already been fragile, her blood pressure dangerously high after delivery. Stress could push her into complications we couldn't afford. She didn't need this, not now. "I'll pay whatever you want," I said through clenched teeth, pulling my wallet from my pocket. "Just take it off." But Karen smirked, sliding the key into her purse as though it were a trophy. No, it doesn't work like that. You'll get the proper notice in the mail. Until then, this car stays put. Rules keep our community civilized, sir. You do well to learn that." Her words felt like knives. Civility? She was chaining a hospital car. My fists curled so tightly my nails dug into my palms. All I could think about was Emily. How I had promised her peace, how she was waiting for me to carry her home, how our newborn needed her mother calm and safe. And here was this woman, this cruel embodiment of control, dangling her authority like a weapon. I took a step forward, but Karen raised her hand, her smirk widening. "Careful," she warned. "Lay a finger on me and I'll have security throw you out of here. Imagine explaining that to your poor wife." Her words burned, but what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that Emily wasn't just any woman and this car wasn't just any vehicle. That car, sleek and black with the government seal etched faintly on its plates, didn't belong to me. It belonged to my brother, the governor. And Karen had just crossed a line that no chain could ever protect her from. I swallowed my fury and stepped back, forcing calm into my tone. "So that's how you want to play this?" She gave a satisfied nod, convinced she had won, convinced that the chain had not only bound my car but my will as well. "Exactly. Maybe next time you'll think before you break the rules." I said nothing more. I turned, walked back into the hospital, and found Emily resting with Grace nestled in her arms. The sight broke me. My wife, delicate as glass after all she'd endured, whispered, "Is everything okay?" I couldn't tell her not yet. I kissed her forehead and said softly, "Everything going to be okay, I promise." But inside, I was already plotting. Karen had humiliated us at the worst moment of our lives, had chained not just our car but our dignity, had laughed while my wife's future health trembled on the edge. And she had done it all under the delusion of authority. She thought she was untouchable. What she didn't know was that she had just ignited a storm far bigger than her petty HOA kingdom. She had poked at a family bound not just by love, but by power she couldn't begin to comprehend. And as I held Emily's hand and watched Grace's tiny chest rise and fall, I made a silent vow. Karen would regret every second of this. She would choke on the same chains she had wrapped around us. She would learn that some rules are bigger than her, and some punishments are heavier than any fine. Because this wasn't just about a car. This was about respect, about family, about the promise I had made to protect my wife at all costs. And I would see it through, even if it meant tearing Karen's kingdom brick by brick until she stood in ruins. The clock on the wall ticked softly, but to me, it was a drumbeat counting down the moments to her downfall. I came back to the car later that evening with my brother on the line, just a short, clipped call that felt like a lifeline. I hadn't told Emily anything beyond "I'm handling it," because every smile I gave her felt bought with a secret I hadn't yet paid for. My brother's voice was calm, the kind of calm that comes from sitting behind a desk where decisions ripple outward. He listened as I explained, the chain, Karen's smirk, the hospital scene, the way she'd leaned into her own power like it was a comfort blanket. When I finished, there was a pause long enough for me to imagine him gathering lawyers in his head. "You keep Emily and Grace safe," he said finally. "Don't do anything rash, let me handle it." Hearing him say, "let me handle it," stirred something that felt like both relief and fear. My brother was the governor. His name carried weight. His calls could start a small tornado in the HOA's little world. Part of me wanted to run back out there, rip the chain off, and drag Karen into the light by her collar. Part of me wanted to throttle her and make sure she felt every second of our fear. But I could see the truth in his tone. This wasn't a moment for brute force. It needed precision. So I did as he said. I stayed inside the hospital while the fluorescent lights hummed, while nurses tiptoed in and out, while Emily slept with Grace tucked to her chest. I watched my brother's name light up my phone with texts that hinted at movement. "I've notified legal. Security will review footage. Hold tight." Those little updates felt like a shield we didn't deserve but were suddenly wrapped in. Even so, waiting was its own war. Each minute felt like the world was trying to swallow us whole. The next morning, the HOA sent a letter, formal, typeset, and smug. It called the car's presence a violation and demanded fines that read like an extra mortgage payment. The letter was unsigned, as if cowardice had learned to use a printer. Karen's name was nowhere on it, and yet I could see her handwriting in my mind, small, sharp, a little too neat. I could imagine her reading it with that same triumphant smile, imagining she built a fortress of rules. By noon, my brother's office had done more than notify legal. A plainclothes investigator had been at the hospital, collecting footage from the parking lot cameras. Security logs were pulled. The investigator's call was clinical but encouraging. "We have footage of the incident. Karen approached the vehicle at 14:12, chained it at 14:15, and refused to allow hospital staff to intervene until 14:22. Those timestamps were like small weapons. They were the record of her cruelty. When the investigator told me Karen had stomped across the hospital lot that day and refused to show her authorization, something inside me cracked open. For months, years, maybe, I'd tolerantly nodded at HOA gossip, at petty fence-line disputes, at rules framed as civility. I'd smiled at potlucks and gone to meetings where Karen talked louder than anyone else, claiming to uphold the neighborhood standards. But this was different. This was predatory. She had found a wound and aimed for it. She had seen a woman who had just birthed a child and thought it a fine time to assert dominance. My brother arranged a meeting with the HOA board. He asked them politely to resolve the matter, which meant they were asked to unlock the car and apologize. He asked hospital administration to issue a formal reprimand to anyone who had been told not to interfere. The HOA replied with a letter that tried to be conciliatory while still blaming the car for creating confusion. It was such a willful misreading it made my blood cold. That evening, I walked Emily to a small window in our hospital room. She watched the parking lot below where still the chain had not been removed in the HOA's paperwork, because their bureaucracy loved the smell of delay. She cradled Grace and whispered, "You can't believe how lucky we are." I pressed my forehead to hers and wanted to tell her how furious I was, how low and mean it felt to have someone set themselves against our joy. But the hospital hummed and nurses shuffled, and there were other mothers who needed quiet. Instead, I let the anger sit beside me like a coiled animal. I told Emily the barest truth. "They chained the car. I called my brother. He's handling it." She nodded, not interested in politics or power plays. She wanted our family to be left alone. She wanted what she had asked for: peace. But peace was not the only thing I wanted. I wanted Karen to know every consequence of tightening that chain. I wanted her to understand the depth of what she had taken, time that could never be replaced, a mother's blood pressure, a newborn's first days. My brother's legal team was compiling evidence, but that would be only the beginning. The first public strike I planned wasn't a scandal or a smear. It was a town hall. My brother's team arranged for the HOA board to attend a meeting with hospital representatives, affected residents, and the press. Karen was invited as a concerned resident, which made her puff up with importance. In my mind, the town hall would be a controlled pressure cooker where every witness, every security timestamp, every nurse's testimony would be oxygen for the truth. On the day of the meeting, Karen arrived wearing her usual armor, heels that clicked like a metronome and jewelry that caught the light. She carried herself like a general who just won a skirmish. She had practiced her smile for this. So had I, because my brother had insisted on restraint. "Let them speak," he'd told me. "Let the world hear them. The truth is heavier than any smirk." Hospital staff came forward. A nurse spoke with her hands trembling, describing how Emily's blood pressure rose and how staff had pleaded for the car to be released. A security guard recited times, matching the investigator's log. Witnesses, residents who were tired of Karen's theatrics, told stories of petty fines and emotional blackmail. The room filled with the soft, dangerous sound of truth finding an audience. Karen tried to speak, and when she did, her voice faltered. She spoke of community standards and order, but the words no longer landed. They bounced like loose coins on tile. People shook their heads. The press scribbled and focused their lenses. Cameras hummed. The governor's office released a statement that didn't attack but framed the incident as unacceptable behavior unbecoming of a community leader. The HOA board, which had once enjoyed Karen's puppet mastery, suddenly looked small and embarrassed. She retreated behind procedure and bylaws, but the bylaw books couldn't explain the human harm captured in security footage, in a nurse's note, in a mother's trembling voice. The more she moved to defend herself, the more it seemed she was only defending a habit of asserting power over others. I watched her face, once smug, now taut. She tried to smile, but it was a smile that belonged to someone who had been caught. At the end of the meeting, the HOA issued a formal apology, couched in legal phrasing that tried to soften the damage. They promised to review policies to improve communication with the hospital to seek reconciliation. Karen offered what she called regret, but her words felt empty and premeditated. She had apologized because her house of cards had been threatened. She had not apologized because she had been wrong. That night, as Emily slept with Grace on her chest, I sat in the small recliner and let my body be hollowed out by the day's events. The apology was a start, but it wasn't enough. Apologies could be written, stapled, and forgotten. I wanted accountability. I wanted Karen to feel the weight of what she'd done, not a performative bow, but consequences that would shape how she treated others for the rest of her life. I wrote a short note, not angry but precise, and slipped it under her door. It read simply, "You will learn to be kinder, or you will be remembered for your cruelty." I didn't know if she read it. Maybe she tossed it aside. Maybe she stared at it and felt a hollow echo settle in her chest. Either way, it was the first step of a different kind of revenge, one that would not break her body but would unmake her comfort. I wanted her to lose that smug certainty that rules are a shield for meanness. The war was far from over. Karen still had allies on the board, and power often hid behind committees and fine print. But for the first time since she'd clipped that chain through our wheel, I felt a strange shift, one that tasted like potential justice. My brother had the law, the cameras had the truth, and the town hall had a witness room full of people who could speak. The ground had moved. And yet, beneath the strategy and the politics, there was still a small, terrified part of me that wanted nothing more than to tuck Emily and Grace into our car, drive away, and pretend this had never happened. For them, for the quiet that healed wounds, I promised myself I would not let this rest until every loose edge of power in that neighborhood was tightened with oversight. Not because I wanted cruelty punished theatrically, but because I wanted to make it impossible for anyone else to be humiliated the way we had been. As the night deepened and the hospital lights softened, I waited for morning. There would be more steps to take. There would be more faces to expose and more paperwork to file. But there was also, now, a light, small and stubborn, that told me we were moving toward a kind of justice that might heal more than just our bruised pride. The morning after the town hall, our house felt both safer and rower. It was as if someone had taken a scab off an old wound to clean it out, painful, necessary, and smelling faintly of antiseptic. Emily moved slower than before, rocking Grace on her chest with a small, careful smile that never quite reached her tired eyes. She would laugh sometimes, a soft sound that made my whole body breathe easier, and then another memory would flash, Karen's face, the chain, the way she'd said, "Rules are rules," like it was a benediction. Those flashes made Emily flinch as if someone had brushed a bruise. After the meeting, I thought the worst was over. The HOA had been publicly embarrassed. The governor's office had pushed. Yet power rarely goes down without fighting. Karen did not go quietly. Overnight, she began a campaign of small cruelties that felt deliberate and surgical. She sent formal complaints about things that had never been mentioned before. A garden gnome that supposedly blocked a walkway, a hedge trimmed an inch too short, a charitable banner left on our porch for a day. They were petty claims, designed to appear bureaucratic but meant to chip away at our peace. What hurt most wasn't the letters themselves. It was how the neighborhood changed its gaze. People who once shook my hand at barbecues now fumbled their words. Some avoided our eye. It was subtle, like frost rolling in across a pond. I could see why Karen thrived. She taught people how to be afraid of being seen on her side of the line. Fear made them small and pliable. That silence felt worse than her padlock. My brother told me to keep a low profile. Let them be loud in paper and quiet in action, he advised. We will continue to document everything. Let them come at us on the records. He was right. And yet every snide note, every sideways glance pulled at me. I wanted to respond with force, to drag every complaint into daylight and see who stood behind it. But the best revenge, I was learning, was the slow, careful kind that used truth as its weapon. One night, a letter arrived that was different. It was stamped with the HOA's official seal and notched with formal legal language that mentioned community safety and unapproved vehicle usage. It demanded an appearance at a hearing in 2 weeks and suggested a fine that would be crippling if upheld. Emily sat beside me at the kitchen table, our daughter asleep in her bassinet, and watched me sign envelopes and make calls. She laid her hand on mine and said, quietly, "Be careful." Her voice trembled like a rope, stretched so thin I could see every thread. The hearing was scheduled in the community center, a place where polite lunch meetings had once been held, and where now I felt like I was stepping into a gladiator pit with fluorescent lights. Karen arrived early, immaculate as ever, as if suffering required a dress code. Her allies, 2 other board members, sat close, whispering and smiling with practiced felicity. The room filled with residents curious for drama and a few who seemed to relish the spectacle. We presented our case with care. My brother's legal team submitted footage, emails, and nurse testimony. The hospital's chief compliance officer spoke with a steady voice about the risk Emily had faced, about professional requests that had been ignored. Nurses testified to how fear had tightened the room and how a mother's blood pressure had spiked because of the incident. It was not melodrama. It was precise, painstaking truth stacked like bricks. Karen's defense was equal parts fury and theater. She recited bylaws, pointed to obscure clauses, and called witnesses who confirmed that the HOA had authority. But the problem with authority is not that it exists. It is how it is used. Watching her, I saw her justification unspool under the weight of evidence. Her allies shifted. Some stammers became longer. The people who had once nodded when she spoke now squinted and tried to remember why they had ever trusted a woman who loved rules more than people. At one point, Karen's lips twitched in a smile that looked for cameras and found only a few residents with tired faces. When it became clear the hearing would not be the theater she expected, she switched tactics. She began to bring up personal things, old rumors, small slanders that sounded like gossip rather than fact. It was a dirty, old trick, discredit the family to avoid the facts. My mother, who had come to show quiet support, felt the strain and gripped my hand under the table with a fierce, protective squeeze. I felt like someone had shoved a fist into my chest and wrenched. Then something happened that shifted the whole room. A young nurse, someone who had been hesitant to speak earlier for fear of community gossip, stood up. Her voice was low but steady. She recounted a memory of Karen on a different day, how Karen had berated an elderly man for parking his service van in a visitor spot while he ran in to help his wife. Her testimony wasn't about bylaws, it was about pattern. More people started to speak. Quiet, reasonable people who shared small indignities that when woven together looked like a tapestry of cruelty. The board, once flush with confidence, faltered. They tried to retreat into bylaws, but bylaws do not explain why a woman would chain a car at a hospital where life and death sit fragile. They do not explain why someone would take pleasure in another's panic. The community began to see a pattern, petty rules enforced like weapons. The room whose silence once protected Karen was cracking. When the hearing concluded, the board issued a decision that surprised me. They rescinded the fines and reprimanded Karen for unilateral actions that had endangered residents. They ordered her to undergo community training and to issue a formal apology to Emily and me. It was not everything. It didn't erase what had been taken, but it was a public written reconsideration that hinted at the end of her unchallenged reign. Yet Karen did not go quietly. She threatened to sue to bring nastier charges. She said she would appeal, that bylaws still mattered, that she remained a defender of order. Her voice turned brittle when her complaints did not land. But in private, her allies dwindled. Some called to say they had been pressured into siding with her. Others, embarrassed by their earlier inaction, wanted to distance themselves. Meanwhile, our family tried to stitch ourselves back together. Emily's doctors monitored her blood pressure and said she was recovering slowly but surely. She was a new kind of fierce, soft, but with a steel thread through it. She began to laugh again, small at first, then louder, as if the sound itself was therapy. Grace grew, cheeks filling, fists curling with the tiny certainty of Bobbies who don't know what battles their parents are fighting. I learned to let small moments heal me. Watching Emily with Grace, seeing the way she hummed a lullaby without noticing, was a kind of revenge in itself. A reclamation of joy that no letter, no chain could steal. Each laugh, each shared glance was antibiotic to the hurt Karen had inflicted. Still, I wanted finality. I wanted more than an apology shorn of feeling. I wanted a change that would prevent future cruelty. So my brother's team proposed a policy. The HOA would create a formal hospital access protocol co-authored with the hospital. It would include clear procedures, immediate contact lines, and penalties for unilateral actions that endangered residents. It would be a structural fix, less thrilling than public humiliation, but much more effective. Karen fought it, of course. She called the policy an overreach, accused the governor's office of meddling, and framed herself as the martyr defending local control. The irony that her version of local control was cruelty wrapped in bylaws was lost on her. The policy passed with a majority. It was dry on paper, but it felt like the sound of locked tumblers turning permanently away from the kind of power she'd brandished. In the end, her world narrowed. No longer could she act on whim, she had to follow procedure. The change she had loved so much, the kind that made people small, no longer fit in that world. Maybe she tried to continue, maybe she wrote angry letters and watched residents avoid her porch. But the worst damage had been done to her authority. The community had seen behind the curtain and did not like the show. That night I sat with Emily and Grace on the couch. The house smelled like warm milk and baby lotion, and for a moment the world was reduced to a small, perfect space. I held my daughter and thought of the chain, the town hall, the hearing, the policy. Revenge had come in many shapes, not only in exposes and public corrections, but in the small, stubborn reformation of rules so they could not be bent into weapons again. It was quieter than I expected and sweeter for it. The weeks after the policy passed felt like we were walking through the aftershocks of an earthquake. The ground was steadier, yes, but every so often I'd hear a crack in the silence, a reminder of the tremor that had torn our peace apart. Emily was healing, her laughter returning in brighter shades, though sometimes she still reached for my hand when the mail arrived, as if bracing for another blow. Grace was growing, her cries sharp and healthy, her small fists clenched like she was already ready to fight the world on our behalf. But beneath those domestic joys, a shadow still lingered. Karen. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She prowled the neighborhood with her clipboard, sunglasses perched like armor, her smile stretched thin as if it had been painted on. She pretended the reprimand hadn't stung, pretended the new policies hadn't shackled her once boundless power. But I could see the cracks. She moved differently now, like someone who'd once held a throne and been told it was only a chair. Still, a wounded ego is dangerous, and Karen was most dangerous when she felt cornered. One night around dinner, I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside. When I stepped onto the porch, I saw her, Karen, standing in front of our house, phone raised, snapping photos of our driveway as if it were a crime scene. "Just documenting," she called when she saw me, her tone sharp, defensive, almost desperate. "We wouldn't want another violation to go unchecked." I didn't answer. I just stood there, arms crossed, letting silence weigh on her. And in that silence, something shifted. For the first time, she looked small. Her phone trembled slightly in her hand before she lowered it and walked away, her heels clicking faster than usual. It was then I realized she was losing grip, not just on authority, but on herself. But Karen wasn't done. A week later, we received another letter, this time not about us, but about our neighbor, an elderly widow named Mrs. Henderson. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades, a woman who brought cookies at Christmas and always kept her lawn tidy. The HOA claimed her garden bench was non-compliant, a petty excuse to harass someone who had neither the energy nor the means to fight back. When Emily read the letter, she slammed it down on the table. "She's going after the weakest now," she whispered, fury shaking her voice. That was when I knew this wasn't only about us anymore. It wasn't just personal revenge. It was about stopping Karen from hurting anyone else. And if the HOA board wasn't willing to strip her completely of power, then it was up to us to make sure she lost it anyway. We organized quietly. I began visiting neighbors, not as a crusader, but as someone asking questions. I listened. People had stories of fines that came without warning, of threats laced through letters, of humiliation during board meetings. Some were small, but together they painted a picture of systematic cruelty. Many were afraid to speak publicly, but in private they confessed relief that someone was finally listening. And slowly I began to see a pattern. Karen thrived on silence, on people swallowing their grievances. Break that silence and she would crumble. My brother's office helped us draft a petition. It wasn't loud or flashy, just a document stating that the community no longer trusted Karen to serve on the board. We gathered signatures discreetly, passing the paper like a whispered secret. At first, people hesitated, their pens hovering. But then one name appeared, then another, and soon the page filled. When Mrs. Henderson added her trembling signature, tears in her eyes, I felt something in me harden. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was justice. Word got back to Karen, of course. It always did. One afternoon, she stormed to our porch, face flushed, voice raised so high I worried she'd wake Grace. "You think you can take me down with your little petition?" she spat, pointing her finger at me like it was a weapon. "I built this community. I've kept it safe. Without me, it will fall apart. People need rules, and they need me to enforce them." I let her rant. I let her words spill like acid until her voice cracked. Then I said, quietly but firmly, "No, Karen, they don't need you. They need kindness. They need someone who doesn't chain a car at a hospital." For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted, desperate for footing, but found none. She stormed off, slamming her heels into the pavement like she could break it. But the truth was simple. She was the one breaking. The petition gained momentum. By the next board meeting, the stack of signatures was thick enough to feel heavy in my hands. We presented it calmly, without theatrics, just a record of voices asking for change. Karen tried to shout it down, waving bylaws and rules, but the room wasn't with her anymore. People she once silenced with fear now met her gaze, steady and unyielding. And then came the vote. One by one, hands rose, not in support of her, but against. When the final count was announced, it was done. Karen was officially removed from the board. She sat frozen in her chair, eyes wide, lips pressed so tight they were nearly white. For a moment I thought she might lash out, throw something, scream. But instead she just stood slowly, gathered her papers with shaking hands, and walked out. The room was silent except for the soft shuffle of her heels, a sound that no longer commanded power but echoed with loss. That night Emily and I sat on the porch with Grace between us. The air was cool, the stars scattered bright. Emily leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "It's over." But I knew better. For Karen, it wasn't over. People like her don't let go easily, and part of me, the part that still remembered the chain biting into steel, the smug tilt of her smile, wanted her to try. Because this time we were ready. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was a war for the soul of our community, and the next round was coming. They say revenge changes the avenger as much as the target. I didn't realize how true that was until the morning a delivery truck pulled into our driveway by mistake, and an anxious driver asked if he could wait while someone double-checked the address. I walked him to the porch, thanked him for the package, and felt unexpectedly gentle. Months before, I might have barked and demanded proof. The chain around my wife's car had taught me to be softer because I had seen how small cruelties unspooled into wreckage. That day, as I handed the driver his clipboard back, I thought about how far we had come, from hospital halls and chains to petitions and neighborhood votes. We had won a battle, but the war had a way of lingering in the bones. After Karen was removed from the board, the neighborhood breathed as if it had been holding its breath for years. People waved more freely. Mrs. Henderson left cookies on porches again. The HOA instituted the hospital access protocol we had pushed for, and for a while rules actually felt humane. My brother's office helped oversee the transition, ensuring the new policy had teeth and clear enforcement. Karen's supporters melted away like fog when the sun rose. It seemed like justice had a neat ending. But Karen did not accept endings that easily. She retreated into the margins and began small campaigns designed to hurt in ways that showed no fingerprints. Anonymous notes appeared, accusing letters slid under doors, and petty citations were mailed from private pedophile services that made the process of contesting them expensive and humiliating. It was a different kind of warfare, ugly because it hid behind other hands. She had learned to weaponize the gray areas. The pain was not as loud as the chain clanking on a wheel. but it was persistent and corrosive. One afternoon, I found 3 letters in our mailbox. Each one accused us of different infractions, one for an old paint shade on the garage, one for a small playground sign in our backyard, and one for a tree limb that had dropped a single leaf onto a neighbor's lawn during a storm. They were ridiculous, written with formal-sounding language that smelled like counterfeit authority. I turned the envelopes over and found no return address. I remembered the look on Corinne's face the last time she'd stood on our porch, sharp, furious, as if she barricaded herself behind thin paper and louder claims. Instead of letting those letters seed fear, I printed them and stapled them into a folder. I started a timeline, date of incident, correspondence, any witness notes. My brother's legal team advised patience and documentation. "They are trying to exhaust you," his advisor said quietly. "Don't give them the satisfaction, keep records, keep calm, let them spend attempts where they fail." It was good advice. Some of it felt like moral arithmetic, turning harassment into data so it could be answered with facts, not fury. At the same time, Emily was changing in ways I hadn't expected. The months after the hospital had carved her into softer edges and harder resolve. She started volunteering at the hospital's maternal ward, not for show, but because she wanted to be present for those who arrived fragile and frightened. She spoke quietly with mothers whose voices trembled and held their hands in that way that makes someone feel less alone. Watching her do that felt like healing. Every time she returned home, she seemed less haunted by the memory, as if serving others had replaced some of the bitterness in her with purpose. One evening, while she hummed a lullaby and rocked Grace, a neighbor came by, Tom, who had been quiet during meetings but had signed our petition. He brought a stack of old HOA minutes and a confession. "I was on the board years ago," he said in a voice rough with regret. "I didn't stop her when she started. I thought small things mattered. I thought rules were safety. I didn't see what they were becoming." Tom's eyes glistened. He spoke about small cruelties he had excused for the sake of order. "We all did," he said. "I'm sorry." That night, Tom cried like a man who had finally unburdened himself. His admission felt heavier than any victory vote. It felt like a community reclaiming its conscience. We realized then that defeating Corinne would not be a single act of punishment. It would be a slow rebuilding. People needed to feel safe again, to trust neighbors and not live under the constant fear of petty vengeance. The petition had removed one person from power, but the culture that allowed her to rise needed to be rechecked and reshaped. That was a bigger task. So we began small. Community potlucks returned with a new tone, less about appearances and more about listening. We started a help network for seniors to have people mow lawns or pick up groceries without asking anything in return. The HOA's new procedures included anonymous reporting systems that prevented a single member from acting alone. We set up quarterly reviews with the hospital administration to ensure the new hospital access protocol stayed active and responsive. Every measure felt like stitches being placed in a wound. But Corinne was relentless and her tactics grew darker. One night, our basement was sprayed with an acid graffiti message. The paint stung the skin of the house like a bitter word. The message accused us of using power and signed with a crude, mocking symbol that I recognized from the notes. The police took reports. The investigation was slow, but the cameras near the neighborhood center had captured a shadowy figure moving late at night, someone with a tall frame and a quick gait. The footage was grainy, not solid enough to convict, but it was a clue. We took precautions. I installed lights and cameras near the driveway, not to be cruel, but to feel a thin layer of safety. My brother's security team checked them, offering advice on motion sensors and legal boundaries. Emily was cautious but supportive. She demanded we not live in fear of a spray-painted word. "We will not let them decide how we live," she said, her voice steady like iron wrapped in silk. Her determination felt like a second armor. The days when the sun warmed the porch and Grace crawled across the grass, I could almost pretend those vandalized nights were a dream. But then my phone buzzed with an anonymous tip. "Check the registry of the private pay-to-file services." I did. There, hidden in fees and small print, were patterns of filings from a cluster of accounts tied to 2 phone numbers that had pinged near Corinne's house. The connection was not definitive, but the line was warm. This time, the evidence had a pulse. We brought it to the police and to the HOA's compliance committee. The committee was cautious. Legal thresholds matter, but the police widened their search. The pressure changed the dynamic. Corinne found herself cornered by the systems she once controlled. Angry letters continued to arrive for others in the neighborhood, but now the investigators matched patterns and traced IPs. The web she'd spun began to fray. One cold morning, there was a knock on our door. A detective stood with a folder, weary but resolute. He told us they had more than suspicions. A small crew hired to push back against community leaders, a list of payees who had been reimbursed by a private trust associated with a shell corporation. My jaw clenched as the detective explained how that trust had been tied back, through a chain of invoices and shell sequences, to an account that, until recently, had been funded by an anonymous donor who lived near our neighborhood. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a thread worth pulling. The probe opened a line directly to Karen. She was questioned, and the scrutiny of her bank records and communications tightened around her like a net. Where once she had smiled through meetings, she now avoided crowds. Her friends went quiet on social media. She lashed out in private messages that were later subpoenaed. The more she flailed, the more the investigation found: small reimbursements, anonymous checks, a pattern of using other people as buffers. It felt like watching a puppet cut the strings that once held it up. When charges were finally brought, for harassment, for filing fraudulent complaints, for orchestrating a campaign to intimidate residents, there was a hush and then a rush of feeling like a community exhaling. The legal process would be long and messy, but the fact that a person who had hidden behind bylaws was facing accountability felt like the weight of the world shifting. That night, as Emily tucked Grace into bed, she sat beside me with a quiet smile. The house felt safe in a way it had not for a long time. "We did it," she said simply. It wasn't gloating, it was recognition of a long fight that had bent and nearly broken us. I looked at her and felt something melt, the last of the anger that had lodged in me like a thorn. There was still a long road, but we were walking it together. As we stood in the hallway, listening to the slow, sure breaths of our daughter, I thought about the chain clinking in the sun months ago. That small, brutal act had set everything in motion. It had pushed me to choose between silence and action, between despair and repair. In the end, the revenge we'd chosen was not only to punish, but to rebuild, to make sure that a rule meant to serve didn't become a blade to cut others. I didn't know how the trial would end. I didn't know if the courts would give us the neat closure we imagined. But I had seen the neighborhood change, watched people offer help without being asked, listened to apologies that felt honest instead of performative. That felt like a different kind of victory, one that could last. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, the kind of scent that clung to old halls where too many secrets had been whispered and too many lies had echoed. I held Emily's hand as we walked up the stone steps, Grace with my mother back home. My wife's grip was warm, steady, yet I could feel the tension in her fingers. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about every mother who had ever been made to feel small, every family dragged through mud by a rule meant to protect but twisted into a weapon. As we entered the courtroom, the murmur of neighbors and community members filled the air like a low storm waiting to break. Karen sat at the defense table, her sharp suit pressed, her face painted with a mask of indifference. But her eyes told the truth, darting, restless, desperate. Gone was the smug arrogance she once wielded at every HOA meeting. Now she looked cornered, a queen stripped of her bored, clutching pawns who had begun to abandon her. She avoided looking at us, but I knew she felt Emily's presence like a blade at her back. The prosecutor laid out the case piece by piece. The fraudulent citations, the shell accounts funding harassment, the intimidation campaign that left neighbors afraid to park in their own driveways. Evidence lit the air like sparks from dry wood, emails, records, anonymous letters matched to her printer. Every detail stripped away the image of authority she had once cloaked herself in. It was not swift, but it was relentless. And for the first time, Karen had no rules to hide behind. I sat still, jaw tight, but my mind wandered to that first night at the hospital, the chain around Emily's car, the helplessness in her eyes, the fury that had burned in me like fire in dry grass. It all came rushing back, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Emily squeezed my hand, grounding me. She whispered, "She can't hurt us anymore." Her voice was soft but strong, like steel wrapped in velvet. I nodded, though deep down I knew healing was slower than verdicts. When the defense finally spoke, they painted Karen as misunderstood, a woman trying to enforce order in a community resistant to rules. They said she had been unfairly targeted, a victim of political retaliation because of my brother's position as governor. Their words were sharp, but they fell flat. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now stood in the gallery, their faces etched with anger and memory. They remembered the late-night fines, the threats, the petty cruelties. Their silence had once been her shield. Now their presence was our weapon. During a recess, Tom, the former board member who had confessed his regrets, approached me in the hallway. His eyes were tired but hopeful. "No matter how this ends," he said, "you've already changed things. People see it now. They won't go back." His words steadied me. Revenge had brought us here, but what came next had to be more than punishment. It had to be rebuilding, reshaping a place where families could breathe again. When court resumed, Emily was called to testify. She walked to the stand with quiet dignity, her every step echoing in the chamber. Her voice trembled at first as she described that night, the contractions, the fear, the desperate rush to the hospital. But as she spoke of the chain, of how she had stood helpless while a neighbor treated her as less than human, her voice grew stronger. She spoke not just for herself, but for every mother, every patient, every family who had been crushed beneath a rule that lost its heart. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of a few muffled sobs. Even the judge looked shaken. Corinne's lawyer objected, claiming it was too emotional, but the damage had been done. The jury had seen the cruelty not as paperwork, not as petty governance, but as lived suffering, and no spreadsheet could erase that. As the trial stretched on, I felt myself caught between anger and exhaustion. There were nights Emily and I would sit on the porch watching Grace sleep through the baby monitor and wonder if it was worth it, if the hours in court, the endless records, the public fight were worth reopening wounds we just wanted to heal. But every time doubt crept in, we remembered the hospital, the chain, and the way Corinne had smirked when she told Emily she should have followed the rules. That smirk had lit a fire I refused to let die until justice was carved into stone. The verdict didn't come quickly. Days dragged. But when it did, the words were clear: guilty on multiple counts of harassment, fraudulent filings, and orchestrating campaigns of intimidation. Sentencing would come later, but the conviction was enough to make the courtroom erupt with hushed relief. Corinne sat frozen, her mask finally slipping. She looked at us then, not with power, but with raw hatred, the kind of glare that burns even when the fire is already out. Emily leaned against me, tears slipping down her cheeks, though her smile was unshakable. "It's over," she whispered. I kissed her temple and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since that night at the hospital. The weight lifted, but in its place came something else, an ache for what we had lost in the fight, for the nights we'd spent in fear, for the innocence of a neighborhood that had once felt like home. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, and neighbors gathered close. Some hugged us, others simply said thank you. We were no longer alone in this. The story had become bigger than us, about fairness, about standing up when power is abused. As I carried Grace from my mother's arms and held her high, I realized this fight wasn't just for revenge. It was for her future, for the kind of community she would grow up in. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't the final chapter. Corinne was gone, but scars remained. And scars have a way of shaping how you move, how you trust, how you live. I didn't yet know what those scars would mean for us or what the next fight might be. All I knew was this: we had faced cruelty and we had not bowed. We had turned pain into power and power into change. And that in itself felt like victory. The sentencing day arrived with a gray sky that seemed to press down on the courthouse. Emily and I walked in together, Grace once again with my mother, and though we tried to appear steady, my chest thudded with unease. This was supposed to be the final chapter, but I knew it could also be the hardest. Punishment had a way of stirring bitterness, and Corinne had always thrived on bitterness. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Neighbors filled the gallery, their faces carrying years of resentment and relief. Some clutched each other's hands, as if bracing for whatever was about to be said. Corinne sat rigid at the defense table, her lips pressed thin, her eyes fixed on some invisible point on the wall. She looked smaller than I remembered, yet the fury in her glance had not dimmed. The judge spoke calmly, reviewing the charges and acknowledging the weight of the case. He described Corinne's actions not as mere rule enforcement, but as a deliberate pattern of cruelty, harassment, and intimidation. He noted Emily's testimony, the anonymous filings, the vandalism, all threads in a web of harm spun for power's sake. Then came the words that seemed to freeze the room. The court sentences you to 18 months in county jail, followed by probation, restitution to the victims, and permanent removal from all neighborhood governance positions. The air broke with a mix of gasps and muffled sighs. Some people even wept quietly. Emily's eyes glistened, her lips trembling as she whispered, "It's real. It's finally real." I pulled her close, my own breath shaky. The chain, the hospital, the months of tension, all of it had led to this moment where justice wasn't just promised, but delivered. Corinne, however, snapped. She shot up from her chair, shouting that the system was rigged, that my brother's role as governor had poisoned the trial, that she was the real victim. Bailiffs moved quickly, their presence firm but calm, and escorted her out as her voice cracked against walls that no longer gave her power. Watching her thrash against reality was both heartbreaking and strangely pitiful. She had built her life on control, and now she had none. After court, neighbors approached us with hugs, handshakes, and words that carried more weight than they knew. One elderly woman, her voice shaky with age, pressed my hand and whispered, "You saved us." It wasn't true. We hadn't saved anyone alone. But together, as a community, we had broken free of something poisonous. That was what mattered. Back home, Emily and I sat on the porch as the evening sun melted into gold. Grace babbled in her stroller, her tiny hands reaching for the air like she was grabbing pieces of light. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No notes in the mailbox, no suspicious stares, no tension crawling beneath the skin of every gathering. Just quiet, just normal. I leaned back and let out a long breath. "It's over," I said aloud, almost to convince myself. Emily nodded, but her eyes softened with the kind of wisdom born from scars. "It'll never be fully over," she murmured, "but we made it through, and that's enough." Her words lingered with me as night fell. She was right. Some wounds don't disappear, they settle into you, shaping the way you live and trust. But those scars could also be reminders, not of what was lost, but of what we refused to let break us. The chain that once clinked against her wheel had started all of this, but it had also led us here. To healing, to justice, to a future where Grace could grow without fear of a neighbor's cruelty hanging over her head. As I carried my daughter inside and watched Emily smile at her, I realized revenge had not been about destruction. It had been about drawing a line in the sand and saying, "Never again." We had taken pain and turned it into something that could protect others. That, more than the verdict, felt like true justice. And though the story had ended in court, the real ending was here. Inside our home, in the steady heartbeat of family, in the fragile but undeniable peace of a neighborhood learning how to breathe again.